Um, Good to see everyone. I just got an unstable computer message, so let's hope that's not the case for everybody. Welcome to the education track of the 2021 Hatched Conference. It's good to see you here. I'm not a morning person, so I'm if a little groggy, that's why. So anyway, it's good to see, and I'm sure we'll have more people coming in. Many of you already know me. I'm Sandy Balkema, English faculty member and dissertation director for DCCL. So been around for a while. I'm also a member of the Innovation Advisory Team. So that's why I'm sitting in this chair today to help you out. I'm going to be serving as the host, which means I'll try to keep track of time, keep Paul and Mari moving, but also then I will be watching the chat. So if you have questions that are coming up as you hear Mari and Paul talk, feel free to put them there, and then we'll talk about them at the end, okay? And I'll help facilitate that. So we have about 50 minutes for today. We're saving about 10 minutes at the end for questions, conversation, and again, we'll keep track of things. We are recording this session, need to make you aware of that. The idea is that anyone who can't attend can listen in later. Okay, so I'm going to hand this off to, I don't know who's going first, I'll let them decide, but we have Mari Kermit-Canfield from Flight and Paul Zube from the Communication Department. So welcome again to our group, and I'll hand it over to Paul and Mari.
Thank you. Mari, you're on the sharing.
Okay, yeah, I will get this going, I guess.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the introductions and for coming to our sessions today. We are going to talk a little bit about our experiences having just almost finished going through a whole publication process with a workbook that I'm going to be using in my classes, and just kind of our general experiences with kind of publishing and that publishing process. And I know that many of you have probably already published, but maybe this is another opportunity to kind of talk about what this is like, goals, aims, experiences. And I think we have a bonus, some bonus content of how to maybe collaborate during a pandemic. Hopefully not a skill set that we have to use very often, but a skill set that Mari and I have as a result had to kind of do some working with. We also, in anticipation of wanting to have discussion, we've put some places in our presentation that we'd love to have some kind of brief conversation during as well as during the end. So that's kind of our plan for today. And then I guess, Mari, do you want me to just say the next slide?
Yeah, or you can beep at me.
Okay, so we'll move on then to the next slide. Where we'll kind of just talk about like the universe of publishing. There's lots of different ways for this to be happening. So I'm sure many of you have already done some peer review stuff. Some of you have probably already done conferences. Some of you maybe have worked in kind of industry sources, done some type of work like white papers, things like that. Self-publishing is also certainly an experience that is starting to fall onto people's radars and onto people's shoulders, and the stuff that they are very interested in. So we are going kind of in a more traditional type of publishing process where we worked with a textbook publisher, but Mari and I both did some work to make them not publish a textbook, which was kind of fun and interesting. But what we ultimately made is a kind of workbook and an interactive workbook that we're trying to deliver online in kind of a cost-conscious way. These things are things that we're going to chat about a little bit later in the presentation. But we are aware that there's lots of different ways that you can kind of enter this publishing world. Ultimately, what I would say would be a strong recommendation to everybody is, publishing is not as terrifying as sometimes people discuss it as being, and that there's lots of options that people have to kind of pursue their goals, and that ultimately publishing work is a way to get what might be really great ideas out into the world so that other people can benefit from those really great ideas. So then I guess we'll move to the next slide, because I think that this one is an animated slide. So this is the book that we did. And then we're going to move into kind of this approach that we kind of felt we had some benefit from. So my experiences previously doing publishing work was either in a graduate research team. So we had a faculty supervisor who was, making sure that we were all on the same page, right? So we were all within a discipline, or we also had, or I've done some stuff kind of by myself. Like I've submitted conference papers kind of on my own. But I would say that this is the first time that I had what I now appreciate as being like a very strong interdisciplinary approach. Like I've done some other interdisciplinary work, but at the kind of end of the day, that was kind of two disciplines meeting each other. But this, I would say, was truly an interdisciplinary approach in that Mari and I had to work collaboratively on this book so that we could accomplish our shared goals. And that interdisciplinary approach, if you are looking to kind of get your ideas out there into the world, or you're not even sure if your ideas are ready to go out into the world, working with a colleague who comes from a different discipline can really help you figure out if those, or kind of look at those ideas from a different perspective. It's a way to potentially, lost my train of thought. It's a way to potentially think about this in a new and interesting way, right? So this interdisciplinary approach is a really valuable approach. And at this point, for myself at least, I don't think that I would try to kind of pursue anything that I would be publishing without at least consulting people outside of my discipline, just because I found it to be a really valuable experience. And then next slide, I think is Mari taking over.
Oh, I think, for both of us, we had things that we really wanted to accomplish. So when you are a librarian who does a lot of instruction, there are just barriers to getting that instruction done. We have a difficult time getting into the classroom to see students. Instructors are busy. They have a really tight schedule for their classes. Sometimes they don't see value of library instruction, or they think they can handle it themselves. And if we do get to do library instruction, then we usually only see students like one time. So there are a lot of things that we want students to learn that we just don't have the opportunity to get to work on. So when Paul approached me with this project, it just seemed so wonderful. A chance to really have students work with all the things that I think are important about research and about information literacy skills, and have that applied throughout a course for an entire semester. And we're going to talk a lot more about how this book we wrote does that. So this book is very based on information literacy, as you saw from its title, and that we did not pull this together in a vacuum. We did a lot of reading for the book, but when you are a librarian who does instruction, you depend on these two seminal works for information literacy instruction. The one on the left is older and has almost been entirely retired and replaced by the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education on the right. I do want to kind of explain. The one on the left, the information literacy standards, was very practical, and every librarian depended on it. So its standards were to define that an information literacy competent student could define their information need. They were able to access information. They could evaluate the information they found. They would be able to use that information and understand the ethics of information. So very practical, right? Very practical to apply that to the research they were doing. When this was replaced by the framework for information literacy for higher education in 2015, which was a real shakeup in the library world. And it happened on the same day as Brexit, so everybody was going crazy. People really had to change their thinking because the framework is based on threshold concepts, concepts that students really have a transformative experience in their understanding of the concept when they really gain an understanding. So the framework is based on these frames, and they are: authority is constructed and contextual, information creation has process, information has value, research as inquiry, scholarship as conversation, and searching as strategic exploration. When we were putting the book together, we really, of course, needed to stick with the really theoretical thoughts of the framework. We need students to go through these threshold concepts and achieve that higher thinking. But this was going to be a very practical book that accompanies a course. So we kind of looked back to the old information literacy standards to find those practical things that students were going to do. So again, those theoretical issues that we did want students to look at or learn about in the book. So why do students need to apply critical thinking to their work? Why is finding and using information an ethical process? Why does one need to have good research skills, not just going through the process of acquiring them, but why is it important to have that? And right now, a big issue addressing misinformation and disinformation is so important in our world. And then, of course, we really needed students to actually be able to learn these skills and perform these skills. So actually doing research, actually selecting the right tools for their research, doing research strategically, when they found information, being able to evaluate it. And we really care about copyright right now in this digital world we live in. So we talk about Creative Commons copyright in our book.
So after kind of taking these three kind of places of information, so this theoretical, why information literacy, a kind of pragmatic how to do information literacy, as well as merging that with our own experiences, the next step that we took so we could make a kind of very purposeful workbook or a purposeful piece of publication is not just to kind of just start writing stuff and like, here's what's top of mind, but we started making some outcomes. So similarly to how, in the more recent conversations about outcomes and assessment at Ferris that all of us have been part of, we also strove to make some outcomes that would drive our purpose, which is on the next slide. So, we kind of took the same mindset of we need to create some outcomes for what we want to accomplish with this book, and then we'll write to those outcomes. So, some of these became chapter titles, but in just kind of like a generalizable way, this kind of brainstorming session that Mari and I went through of, by the time someone reads this book and they're done getting through this whole workbook, what do we want them to have achieved? And let's make sure that we kind of cover all those things and make a checklist. From an experience perspective, I think both of us found this to be really valuable. This ended up kind of becoming an outline, a checklist. Like we used these types of ideas in a variety of ways, but it really helped guide and keep us on track for what it is that we were trying to accomplish. So we also really aimed to try to make these outcomes to be kind of action oriented. So here's what students will be able to do. As Mari had mentioned, we had kind of an interest now, like increasingly information literacy is not just about finding information, but it's about creating information and synthesizing information. Many of our students are information producers, even if they don't think of themselves as being information producers. And so kind of they should be able to create a Creative Commons copyrighted document. Right, so putting these in the "you should be able to" statements, what they will be able to do. Again, like some of this was informed from all of the discussions that I had about assessment at Ferris. Like that was very helpful in producing this book, but also just through the brainstorming sessions that Mari and I had, creating kind of a purposeful thing we want to accomplish with this book was really helpful in organizing our thoughts, organizing this book, and trying to keep us on track while we were kind of putting these things together, which I think is a really useful practice. Which I think leads us to our first break session, or our discussion section. So I don't know what's going on in the chat, if anything, but are there questions about kind of the starting approach that we had, why we tried to do this the way that we're doing this, what was kind of influencing us, or what you might have questions about, like if you were kind of interested in starting working on something for your class? So we'll wait for this is the appropriate amount of silence. Then it gets into the slightly uncomfortable. And then into the wildly uncomfortable. All right, so I'm going to guess that no questions then for our first discussion time, which either means that this is going swimmingly or less than swimmingly. I'm just going to assume that it's going well. So we'll kind of move on then to kind of the next step. So we kind of had these plans. This was our project. This is what we wanted to do. We started doing some organizing stuff. We kind of were thinking about this in an interdisciplinary way. The next thing that we're going to kind of start working on then is this collaboration process for a pandemic, right? So collaboration is going to be particularly important in any work that you're doing. Like, as I mentioned before, I really appreciated that interdisciplinary approach that we had tried to use, and that it's something that I definitely want to be making use of for the rest of my career when it comes to producing any type of work. But during a pandemic, this becomes particularly difficult. And so now Mari and I have these skills as well. And I'll let Mari kind of work through what that process looked like in a tangible way for us.
So yes, I would say that the pandemic is a really fundamental part of what made this a more challenging collaboration and a more interesting collaboration. There are a lot of things that I think we would have done anyway in management of materials, but working with somebody almost completely online has been really interesting. So I have seen Paul one time in person since we started this project, and he was having one of the worst cases of mask glasses fogging I have ever seen. So I'm hoping he's improved that since then. When we got started on this, we had a couple things that were really important to us for the book, or that became important to us as we did discuss things with the publisher that had approached Paul for this project. So we wanted the book to be really cost efficient for students, so $25 or under. And they told us they could only do that as an ebook, and we said, great, it needs to be interactive and it needs to be ADA compliant. And after that, yeah, everything was online. I've been joking that I'm running out of things to write on around here and also losing all my pens. I have one pen and no paper right now. Completely lost that. So we were very dependent on the OneDrive to keep track of our materials. We wrote all in Word as the publisher requested. Even if we created graphics, they had to go into a Word document. We tried to be very, very organized. We had eventually a really specific naming system for all of our files. And we kept a working outline. So you can see that we would have our, where is it? So we would have, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. We would have our goals for the outcomes for each chapter. So what a student was supposed to learn. And then we would have the activities for that chapter. And eventually we would have a narrative for each chapter. So the narrative would often contain the theoretical information that we were asking students to learn, and the activity would contain the practical learning section that was associated with that chapter as well. This working outline transformed itself into the final table of contents that was submitted to the publisher eventually. We haven't seen the final version of this yet. This is what we submitted. So it transformed, and you can see each chapter has a narrative and activities associated with it.
So hopefully what you have been able to see so far is kind of going from those high level goals that we have kind of translating into the actual content that we have. You don't actually have to read this. That is not part of the presentation, is where you have to learn how to write research questions. But one of the things that we also used as a resource throughout, and I don't know how comfortable people are with kind of digitally collaborating with one another. But one of the nice things about OneDrive is, even for a document like this that is a text document, you can do the same kind of track changes and that type of functionality that Word works, or that Word has. But instead of emailing versions back and forth from one another, it saves one common document. If you've ever used Google Docs, basically OneDrive is doing a very similar thing to Google Docs, so that you can keep tracks of versions much more easily. So when we were writing narrative sections like this, right, it was very easy to kind of check on each other, see who's added what and when. As you can also see from kind of the previous slides, those folders have like the update times, right? This was a really valuable tool in a pandemic where the two of us are not working together, to kind of keep track of our goals and our writing process and make sure that we're achieving what we need to be achieving. But also just in general, so that these tools are incredibly helpful, as opposed to having to do version control, right? So I don't know about many of you, but for documents like what's on the screen, I used to have V1, V2, V3 as I was making them. Using some of the tools that we have available now, the version control is a little easier. It's a little more intuitive. So we had narrative sections like this, as was mentioned, that tried to kind of drive home the point and the purpose of what each section was doing. On the next slide would be one of the examples of kind of the doing it type of stuff. Like, we would really like the students to have gone through an experience. So the reason why we went with a workbook as opposed to kind of a more traditional textbook is to put more emphasis on this doing of activities, since we know from learning theory that engagement, as opposed to like solely reading about something, or application as opposed to kind of solely witnessing something, is much more effective when it comes to learning things. So we would create things like this. One of the things that we were trying to achieve with this interactive approach in this kind of ebook format is where it says space for 50 words. That should just be a thing that a student could be able to write into. Same for the space for 300 words. It's kind of giving some students some direction while also keeping this somewhat autonomous, right? Because one of the goals for this book is that this is a thing that students could be doing kind of on their own, which I'll kind of get back to in a second, not in a second, in a few minutes. But so we kind of try to give them these types of directions. So some of the activities look like this. Another great thing about this and this interdisciplinary approach is on the next slide. Mari put together and has been using some really useful approaches to information literacy in particular, and like this project helped her find a home for it. And so I'll have Mari kind of speak a little bit more about this really fun activity.
Yeah, so I would say Paul and I have a different writing tone in our writing. I'm a little more humorous. This is, and I have a backlog of instructional activities from the 12 years I've been at Ferris teaching. And this project provided kind of a final resting place for a lot of them. So this is a popular meme format that I applied to authority evaluation, basically. And I asked if they would have somebody else redo the drawings and make them a little more pretty, and the answer was no. They liked it the way it was. So I was happy to have projects like this go to a good home where they would actually be used, outside of my classroom work once in a while.
So we had our own process. And another thing for those of you who have not had the pleasure of working with others who are in publishing, they also have their own system. So one of the last things that we kind of learned through this process was interacting with the publishers' systems. So while we were doing our thing and had to do our own collaborative approaches because of a pandemic, we then eventually had to integrate that with the publisher's space, which I was personally kind of surprised that the tools that we have available were a little bit more intuitive than the tools they had available. But these are the things that are going to happen sometimes. So we ultimately had to translate these things, do the formatting stuff, right? That's the less interesting hard work that has to happen in a publishing process, the little nitty gritty minutia stuff. But overall, I feel like Mari and I were able to translate our vision into these various systems so that on the last slide, or the next slide, we have like a workbook, right? So here is a project that we now have completed. Like we went through this process. We've done this during a pandemic. As we'll also talk about in a moment, we probably did this under way too much time pressure to accomplish this. And yet we were still able to produce this book that I'm looking forward to implementing in my own class. I'm also happy to chat with any of you if you are interested in maybe adopting this as well. But we, without trying to like only be thinking about the end product, I think the process that we used, the approach that we had, the goal-driven and kind of outcome orientation that the two of us had kind of led to a pretty reasonable workbook that helps students accomplish some tasks. And ultimately at the end, like that's why we're doing all this work, is to try to help students by doing kind of the publishing work we have, which leads us into our next kind of discussion. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to jump in and be clear. So this book is not standalone. This book is meant to be used in any class that is doing a research project, and it is a series of little readings and research assignments that by the end of the course, the student will produce a major research project. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Oh no, you're fine. I was just transitioning to our next discussion section. So from this process that we had, kind of anything like that, were there questions that kind of showed up here? that we can.
I have one for you. This is Sandy.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that a publisher approached you, Paul. Tell us a little bit about that process, how you found out that that was an appropriate publisher for what you wanted to do. Did you do any comparing? So kind of the publishing background, okay?
Yeah. So for those of you who teach in classes, you probably get those spam emails all the time from various publishers kind of hawking their book, or sometimes there's smaller publishers who are looking to publish a book. Probably for the last 4 or 5 years, I have kind of ignored those things. But I personally have been in a transition away from traditional textbooks, just because my philosophy about what my students need from their readings is changing, and kind of the textbook landscape and me kind of paying attention to that is changing. So I started actually paying a little bit more attention to some of those solicitation emails, because the types of books and readings that I was picking for my students, while I do think that as a overall reading experience they are better, one of the things that textbooks do kind of do well is kind of having those activities and kind of front loading, here's what you should get out of it. And I had looked for some information literacy stuff as I had been trying to adopt different types of books for my various classes. And anything that's kind of information literacy was either highly theoretical or it was incredibly expensive, right? It was a textbook for an information literacy class as opposed to a companion piece. So I kind of started to feel like there was maybe a little bit of a niche here. I kind of had some ideas. I happened to be able to reach out or kind of take a phone call or arrange a phone call through an email with one of the smaller publishers. And they had talked about how they had some people who were creating workbooks. It was at that point like, that's kind of an interesting idea. I don't know if I could all by myself though make a workbook. And so that's when I reached out to Mari, be like, hey, here's kind of a project, and what would you think about taking this on? And do you think that this fits a niche? And so Mari and I started having those types of conversations, and then I got back in touch with the publisher. I know that that is a very different publishing experience than maybe others, right? So I have several friends who have also been working on book projects, different types of book projects with different types of audiences. And as a result, right, they are having to do a lot more unsolicited type of cold calls or sending in manuscripts to those publishers. I've had some friends who have gone through an agent, right? So the book publishing world is a really, there's a lot of different ways of kind of getting into it. For the work that Mari and I did, in some ways kind of working through an academic small book publisher made maybe the most sense. And as far as kind of comparing went, like, I honestly did not do a lot of comparing, though in retrospect, I think Mari and I probably should have done a little bit more. Instead, it was more of a, here's an opportunity that's in front of us, and let's try this project out. Because I think for both of us, this is the first type of project like this that we had done in our careers. And we learned a lot from that. And I think that's also a thing that we want to make sure we chat about.
Kristen Conley has a question for you. Kristen, do you want to pose it, or would you like me to read it? I think she was saying
struggling with the mute. I'm struggling with the mute button. Okay, so
there you go.
I'll share. So my one question was exactly how it was interactive. I know you talked about just kind of like typing, and is that the only component that's interactive, or are there other components that are interactive as well? And then when I'm thinking about interaction and kind of working with students and having them do stuff like that, would it be something that they could do on their phone? Those are my two questions, I guess. Because I have a lot of students that struggle with doing things on their phone, and they say they have internet, but it really is just their phone. So that's why I was wondering.
There are some drop-down menus and some charts where you have to like circle things. So I would say this would work poorly on a phone. I have not tested it. We have not seen the final version yet. But we, with the interactivity, we were very firm that it needed to remain ADA compliant, as even while they built in interactivity. it's also in a EPUB format. So yeah, I would say it should be used on a computer.
Yeah, that's probably where it is right now. I know one of the things that we're also trying to do is make edits to it over time and probably try to add some functionality. So one of the places that I won't say it was conflict with the publisher, but I think Mari and I were driving the conversation about accessibility, interactivity, and just ability to make use of it on multiple platforms more than the publisher was, and more than the publisher was ready to be. So in some ways, I think some of the legacy publishers are thinking about this, but maybe not as aggressively as some of the authors that they're going to start working with would be. But from our experience, I think you can push them a little bit to do things that they were not necessarily ready to do. And I could see if we're kind of pushing them with edits and additions in the future, which, you know, I really don't want to just do like an addition every year. I think like that's one of the things that I'm trying to push back on. But if one can make some real functionality things like mobile accessibility with an e-publication, you know, that's a reason to kind of push them. And I think that that's a thing that Mari and I might be doing as we go through this editing process. And thank you for putting that like immediately onto my radar, because that's also a thing that I run into with my students.
We're also told that next year it's going to be moved from the EPUB format to a web platform, which the description sounds like a Canvas module from what we're told. So I'm interested to see what that will look like. And that's supposed to have increased functionality. So yeah, maybe it'll be more mobile friendly.
Other questions for this discussion time? Because that's kind of what I really wanted to do more than anything, is have discussions with people.
Do you ever have a time where you got really stuck? And if you did, how did you get unstuck?
Sure. Mari, do you want to start, or do you want me to start on that?
I personally had a lot of time of staring at the computer, wondering what I would write about these concepts that I've taught for, you know, a very long time, and then would have to leave the computer for, you know, a few hours, come back, and then I would write the activity and then go back and write the narrative later. Yeah. And I also feel like we wrote the book backwards, kind of. We wrote the harder research topics first, and then the easier things in the introduction last. I think it helped us unstick.
Mm-hmm. I know that I also struggled. Like, there are kind of two things that I struggled with. One was a little bit of an imposter syndrome, right? So as a communication faculty member, I encourage my students to do research. We discuss research and things like that. But that is actually, like, information literacy is not my area of expertise. I'm parallel to it, I'm tangent to it, and I'm working with an expert on information literacy. And so every time I sat down to kind of do some work, I felt like I was an imposter, because I'm writing some stuff that an expert in information literacy is going to be reading. One of the ways that kind of helped me get past that is, in addition to kind of doing the reading and research that, you know, one should be doing when they're trying to write stuff, I also, you know, try to remind myself that every time you write something, that's a draft, right? It's not a one and done. And so being able to kind of work with Mari and get feedback with Mari and keep kind of in my own head Mari as a person that I was going to be accountable to, but would also be kind of supportive and helpful, I think really helped me get through that imposter syndrome a little bit. And that might actually be the first time that Mari knows that, because when one does an imposter syndrome stuff, they don't mention that they are like they are an imposter, right? So that's kind of one thing that I feel like was a sticking point for me at times. And the other was, we were doing much of the heavy lifting on this book during the previous semester. So I think I got in contact with the publisher in kind of a meaningful way in like July of last year. They didn't really get back to us in a meaningful way until August of last year. So during the semester of, fall 2020, where we're still trying to deal with some pandemic stuff, there's all the kind of pressures of doing kind of this online stuff. I was doing hybrid stuff. My students were still kind of not sure how their work process was going. All that's going on for me while I'm also trying to produce this book. Again, like having a person to be accountable to helped me through that also, right? So one of the other reasons why I think it's really helpful to maybe have a collaborating partner is, we can set goals for ourselves. And like, I'm pretty good at listening to my own goals, but we can negotiate with ourselves really well. I'm much better when I have someone else that I'm accountable to. So having an external person, and even then, like, I definitely miss some deadlines, right? And Mari kind of helped me out. But Mari was a person that I could be accountable for. So kind of having some partnerships, some people to be accountable for, some people that you can get some support from, that you can kind of rely on and can encourage you. I think those are all ways to kind of get unstuck.
I think you brought up a couple of good points about the collaboration. In fact, Kristen has a question that's related to this. Collaborating and working together. Can you describe more about, from your outline, it looked like you each kind of took chapters. How did that work and how did your review process work? So a little bit more about like kind of how you decided who took the lead on what pieces.
I think that Paul took the parts that he felt were really applicable to his course and that he had been teaching for a long time. So things like writing a research question had been parts of his classes for many years. And I took a lot of the very library-centric topics. So things like searching in a database, selecting a database, felt very natural for me to select those. And then we would decide kind of what an activity would look like and what a narrative would look like and discuss it a little bit. We also decided what the goals were for the chapters together before we divided the content. So, regardless of what an activity would look like, we knew what the learning outcome would be for that chapter and had agreed upon that. Also, the learning outcomes were graded by difficulty, so that throughout the book, it increased in all the activities increased in difficulty as they went.
Kristen, did you want to follow up with more on that, or is that what you were hoping for?
I was kind of like that, but so as you each did different chapters, how did you come together to give like the tone of the book, or like one voice for the book? That was what I was wondering. How did that, or did? Sorry.
So we ended up through Zoom. We had a standing meeting every week, and sometimes we met 2 times a week. So I think it was really important for us, even though sometimes writing can feel like a very isolating thing, like you're the one sitting in front of a computer, slapping your fingers against some keys, right? I think the fact that we met so often kind of kept us on the same vision and kept us working towards the same goals. And also had that accountability component, right? Like, I know I'm going to see Mari on Tuesday. I better have something to talk about. But when it came to tone, I think we also just through kind of reading each other's stuff, we kind of, I think in some ways that was a place that we matched. But I would say that I think honestly, you can still tell who wrote which. Some of that I think is a result of the timetable that we ended up being on. Another thing is I think that both of us we're relatively new to kind of doing a collaborative, co-written, long form piece. And so I definitely think that there's places where we could work on some tone. And if I think we did it again now, we would probably spend more time flipping sections or flipping drafts back and forth. I think might be one way to try to do some tone stuff so that every word had each person's contribution or every sentence. I personally, right, so one thing that I don't really love to do is co-edit with people, but I also recognize that that's a really important thing to do. So I have disliked sitting down and like going through a paragraph with another person in that time. Like I like to kind of do my editing in my time, and then we kind of come back and forth, right? I think that is a thing that I'm a little more comfortable with, but from tone, sometimes you got to get a little out of your comfort zone, and it's worth spending time just kind of sitting down and be like, how would you write this? And things like that. I don't know if Mari, if there's things that you would also have done a little bit differently with A, more time, or B, the knowledge that we now have.
Well, we did actually do some things, like we spent time normalizing our vocabulary so that we were on the same page about terminology, especially for library material and information literacy vocabulary. Because when we started out, we were not in agreement about that kind of vocabulary. So we did work on that. I agree that we have different tone and voice in our writing. And again, I'm a little more glib than Paul, and I tend to write shorter things based on what I think students read, and Paul's are longer. So yeah, I think we would be more comfortable trying to integrate if we were to do it again.
We have about 2-3 minutes left. Other questions from the group? Are there things that Paul and Mari want to add here, or do you want to keep it open for discussion for the last couple minutes?
I'm cool with keeping it open for discussion if people have questions. And I guess like the one thing that I would say though is if you even kind of sort of think that you have an idea that's worth pursuing, like go ahead and pursue it. The worst thing that can happen is it doesn't get published. And if you're not trying to get it published, that wasn't going to happen anyway. So give it a whirl. It's not the end all be all, but it's also not terrifying.
It'd be interesting next year to have a similar session and find out people who've had similar experiences and how they're publishing, connections with publishers, et cetera. I mean, I think this process is a good one for us to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyone else? All right, well, we still have a minute or so yet, so we're not gonna close or shut anybody up. So we'll keep this open and let conversation happen if you like. Looks like Brooke put a few suggestions for other sessions that you can attend and should attend. So hope you're participating the rest of the day. Closing comments from our speakers. Go for it, Paul says. I think that's a good one. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, this is a learning process, I would say, but a worthwhile learning process. And you can always edit stuff.
I would say that, I'm actually very happy we're in the EPUB format, because it is going to make it really easy for us to make edits after Paul starts using the book in his courses. We're still hoping it gets to this semester, but we're still waiting on the publisher. they gave us very, very, very tight deadlines, and then we would wait on them for weeks. So we're again waiting on them right now, and Paul's supposed to be using that book right now and doesn't have it. But because it is in EPUB format, it is easy for us to make changes. So we were hoping for 1 semester of application and then to make some edits over the summer. But if they don't hurry up, then that's going to make that difficult. Yeah.
Well, again, thank you very much. Been very informative and I hope inspiring for people. I hope others try the same thing. We're supposed to have about a 10-minute lead time, so we'll let people move to their next sessions. If you do want to stay for a minute to talk to Paul and Mari, I'm sure they'd be willing to do that. Again, thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And thanks for moderating, Sandy.
Absolutely. Good to see both of you guys. I
Yeah.
miss contacts on campus.
No, I miss running into you for coffee.